My name is Natalie Brooks. I am 31 years old, and I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. What happened to me started with a car accident, but it ended with a truth that shook my entire family and a single phone call that rewrote everyone's power. Let me ask you something. What would you do if you were fighting for your life after a car accident, and the one person who should protect your child refused to even hold your newborn? How do you breathe when betrayal comes from your own mother? And what happens when silence hides greed, control, and secrets no one wants exposed? Now imagine this. While I lay helpless in a hospital bed, one man picked up the phone. No yelling, no threats, just one calm call. Why did that call terrify everyone? Stay till the end, because justice doesn't always arrive loud, but it always arrives on time. One moment, my life was painfully ordinary. I remember my hands on the steering wheel, my mind drifting between hospital checklists and baby names, my body exhausted but hopeful. I was 8 months pregnant, driving slower than usual, talking softly to my unborn child like I always did. I never saw the other car coming. The impact was violent, metal screaming, glass exploding, my body thrown forward as if gravity itself had betrayed me. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, everything felt distant, like I was underwater. Machines beeped around me. Bright lights burned my vision. I tried to move, to speak, to ask about my baby, but my body refused to obey. I later learned I had lost consciousness at the scene and was rushed into emergency surgery. Doctors were fighting for 2 lives at once, mine and my child S. In that hospital room, while I lay completely powerless, decisions were being made for me. Not medical ones, those were in capable hands, but personal ones, family ones, the kind of decisions a mother is supposed to make for her own child. I didn't know it then, but the accident didn't just take my strength. It handed control to people who were waiting for exactly that moment. When my baby was born, fragile but alive, I wasn't there to hold them first. I wasn't there to whisper comfort or feel that first breath against my skin. Instead, hospital staff turned to my emergency contacts, and that's where everything began to go wrong. My mother arrived with a tight smile and sharp questions, not about my condition, not about whether I'd wake up. Her first concern was what happens next. Who signs what? Who decides where the baby goes? Who takes responsibility? The nurses expected a grandmother's tears. What they got was hesitation, distance, a refusal wrapped in polite words. "She's not in a position to decide," my mother said about me, as if I was already gone. "This is complicated, complicated." That word echoed in my head later, once I could think clearly again, because there was nothing complicated about a newborn needing care, but power, control, image. That was complicated enough to make a grown woman step back from her own grandchild. Lying there unconscious, I couldn't protect my baby. I couldn't argue. I couldn't even feel anger yet. All I could do was exist, breathing through machines, while my place as a mother was quietly challenged. Doctors stabilized me after hours that felt like days. When I finally drifted into a shallow sleep, the room felt colder, empty. I sensed something was wrong long before anyone said a word. The nurses' expressions changed. Conversations stopped when I stirred. People whispered in hallways instead of speaking openly. That's when I realized the accident hadn't just injured my body. It had exposed a weakness others were ready to exploit. I wasn't seen as a mother in recovery. I was seen as a risk, an obstacle. Someone temporarily removed from the board so pieces could be rearranged. My authority, my voice, my role, suspended because I couldn't open my eyes fast enough to defend it. And the scariest part, everyone thought it was justified, that while I was out, someone else should step in and take over. They told themselves it was for the baby's safety, for the family's stability, for the future. But deep down, I believe they felt relief. Relief that I couldn't object. Relief that I couldn't stop what was coming next. Because power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it slips in quietly, wearing concern like a mask, waiting for the exact moment you're too weak to resist. That car accident didn't just leave me injured. It marked the moment my life split in two, before I knew who was really on my side, and after I learned how quickly love disappears when control is on the line. And while I lay there, unaware, the first move in a much bigger game had already been made. When I finally woke up, the first thing I felt wasn't pain, it was panic. A deep, animal fear that crawled up my chest before my mind could even catch up. My hands moved instinctively to my stomach. Flat, empty. That's when reality hit me harder than the crash ever could. My baby was no longer inside me, and I had no idea where my child was. I tried to speak, but my throat burned. Tubes, wires, machines. Everything reminded me I was still trapped in a body that wasn't fully mine yet. A nurse noticed my eyes fluttering and rushed over, gently explaining that my baby had been delivered safely. "You're both alive," she said, like that was supposed to calm me. But then she hesitated. Just for a second, and that pause told me everything was not okay. I asked for my mother. The nurse looked uncomfortable. She exchanged a glance with someone near the door before answering. "She was here earlier," she said carefully. "She made some decisions." That word again, decisions. What I learned next felt unreal, like something pulled from someone else's nightmare. My mother, my own flesh and blood, had refused to take responsibility for my newborn. She didn't want the baby in her care, didn't want to stay overnight, didn't want her routine disrupted. She told the staff she was too overwhelmed and that this wasn't what she signed up for. Let that sink in. While I lay unconscious after a car accident, my mother looked at my child, her grandchild, and said no. No holding, no bonding, no stepping up when it mattered most. She dressed it up in calm words and reasonable excuses. She mentioned her health, her schedule, her stress. She even implied that my situation was unstable and that waiting was the smarter choice. Waiting for what? For me to wake up and fight back? What hurt the most wasn't just the refusal, it was the lack of emotion behind it. No tears, no urgency, no instinct to protect, just distance. Like my baby was an inconvenience instead of a miracle. I kept asking why. Why wouldn't she just be there, temporarily, even for one night? The answer came in fragments, through whispers and side conversations I wasn't supposed to hear. She didn't want responsibility without control. She didn't want attachment without authority. And she definitely didn't want witnesses to the choices she was already planning. That's when I realized this wasn't about fear or confusion. It was about power. By refusing my newborn, my mother positioned herself as the decision-maker without the burden of care. She could influence outcomes without getting her hands dirty. She could claim concern while keeping her distance. And worst of all, she could paint me as incapable while I was still too weak to defend myself. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my heart breaking in slow motion. Every second away from my child felt like a failure I didn't choose. Mothers are wired to protect, to fight, to show up even when it hurts. And yet the woman who raised me had done the opposite, at the exact moment I needed her most. The nurses were kind, but kindness doesn't replace family. I could see it in their eyes. They were confused too. They didn't understand how a grandmother could walk away so easily, how love could shut off like a switch. That was the moment something inside me changed. The pain turned into clarity. If my own mother could refuse my child when I was at my weakest, then this wasn't just emotional neglect. It was betrayal, and betrayals like that don't happen by accident. They're choices, calculated, deliberate, and revealing. As I lay there, barely strong enough to lift my head, one truth settled deep into my bones. I could never unsee this. I could never unfeel it. And I would never forget who stepped back when my baby needed them most, because some wounds heal. But the moment you realize love is conditional, that moment stays with you forever. As my body slowly healed, my mind woke up faster, and that's when the real damage became clear. I couldn't sit up yet. I couldn't walk. I couldn't even hold my baby without assistance. But I could listen, and I could observe, and in those quiet hospital days, silence became my greatest teacher. People spoke differently around me when they thought I was asleep. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when my eyes opened. Phones were taken into hallways. Paperwork appeared and disappeared without explanation. No one said anything directly, but everything felt calculated. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. Trauma does that to you, right? Makes you suspicious, makes you sensitive. But patterns don't lie. My mother visited less and less. When she did, she stood instead of sitting, checked her watch, asked questions that had nothing to do with my recovery and everything to do with timelines. When will you be discharged? What did the doctors say about long-term effects? Have they talked to you about limitations? Limitations. That word landed heavy. She wasn't worried about my pain. She was worried about my capacity, whether I could still function, whether I could still manage things, whether I was still useful. That's when I realized this wasn't just family drama. This was positioning. While I focused on healing, others were quietly rearranging the narrative. I wasn't a mother recovering from trauma. I was being framed as unstable, vulnerable, questionable. Someone who needed help. And help in their language meant oversight, control, authority. I stayed quiet on purpose. I stopped asking questions out loud. I nodded, I thanked people. I let them believe I was too weak to notice what was happening. Because when people think you're broken, they get careless. They reveal themselves. I noticed documents with my name on them that I hadn't signed. I noticed how my mother spoke for me instead of with me. I noticed how decisions were justified for the baby's best interest, while completely excluding me from the conversation. That phrase, best interest, was being used like a weapon. They said it when they limited my access. They said it when they delayed bonding time. They said it when they questioned my future as a parent. And every time they said it, my voice disappeared a little more. But here's what they didn't know. I was listening. Every word, every tone shift, every slip of truth hidden behind concern. I wasn't just recovering, I was collecting evidence. The silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Because the more they talked, the clearer it became that this was never about love. It was about optics, money, influence. Who would be seen as the responsible one if things went wrong? Who could claim moral high ground if decisions were questioned later? They were building a story, one where I was the problem and they were the solution. And in that story, my baby wasn't a child. My baby was leverage. That realization broke something in me and rebuilt something stronger. I stopped crying when my mother left the room. I stopped hoping she would change. I stopped expecting fairness. Instead, I started preparing. I asked nurses quiet questions. I requested copies of reports. I memorized names. I paid attention to timelines. Because when people underestimate you, they forget you're still capable of thinking. Every day, my body grew stronger. And every day, my resolve hardened. They thought my silence meant surrender. They thought my stillness meant defeat. What they didn't understand was this. Silence isn't empty. It's observant, it's patient. And sometimes it's deadly accurate. By the time I was discharged, I knew exactly who I could trust and who had already chosen a side. I knew who saw me as a mother and who saw me as an obstacle. And most importantly, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't over, not even close. Because when people try to take your voice while you're healing, they forget one dangerous truth. Eventually, you get stronger. And when you do, you remember everything. And I remembered it all. The call didn't come with drama, no raised voices, no threats, no warnings, and that's what made it terrifying. I wasn't even in the room when it happened. I was resting, still weak, still monitored, when the atmosphere outside shifted. You know how you can feel tension before you see it. Like the air tightens and people start choosing their words carefully. Nurses moved faster. Conversations dropped to whispers. Someone closed a door that was usually left open. Later, one of the senior nurses leaned close and said quietly, "Your grandfather called." Just that. No explanation, no emotion, but her eyes told me everything. My grandfather wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. He didn't announce himself. He was the kind of man whose name carried weight because of what it represented. Decades of discipline, quiet authority, and a reputation built in boardrooms where mistakes cost millions. He didn't raise his voice because he never had to, People listened before he finished speaking. That day, he asked for one thing: clarity, not permission, not access. Clarity. He wanted to know why his great-grandchild hadn't been placed with family, why his granddaughter's authority had been questioned, why decisions were being made without legal grounding. And most importantly, who exactly thought they had the right to make them. Suddenly, everyone wanted to review the situation. Administrators appeared, legal counsel was consulted. Policies were quoted carefully instead of loosely. The same people who spoke confidently days earlier now chose their words like landmines, because my grandfather didn't argue emotionally. He asked questions, precise ones, questions that exposed gaps, conflicts, assumptions that couldn't survive scrutiny. He asked who had medical power of attorney. He asked who had legal guardianship. He asked whether refusal of care had been documented, and by whom. He asked why a mother recovering from trauma was being discussed as unfit without assessment. And with every question, the room grew quieter, because concern can be dismissed. But documentation, that's different. My mother, who had moved freely before, suddenly wasn't being consulted first. Her statements were being verified. Her intentions were being examined. The tone changed from confidence to defensiveness. That's when I knew the balance had shifted. My grandfather didn't accuse. He didn't insult. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply reminded everyone calmly that he was watching now, that he understood systems, that he respected process, and that he expected the same in return. One phone call did what weeks of silence couldn't. It forced accountability. By the time I was informed of the details, my access to my baby had changed. The restrictions were lifted, the language softened. I was no longer described as vulnerable but as recovering, not questionable, but capable with support. Words matter. And suddenly, the words were working in my favor. My mother's behavior changed too. She became polite, careful, almost distant. The same woman who once spoke over me now spoke less. The authority she thought she held had limits she hadn't anticipated. That's the thing about power. It works best when no one challenges it. But once someone does, even quietly, it starts to crack. I never heard the call myself. My grandfather didn't recount it with pride. He didn't dramatize it. When I thanked him, he simply said, "You weren't being protected, so I stepped in." That was it. No lecture, no guilt, no demand for gratitude, just protection. And in that moment, something settled inside me. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. What I sensed, the manipulation, the positioning, the quiet takeover was real. And now it had been seen by someone who knew exactly how to shut it down. That one call didn't just change procedures. It changed how everyone saw me, not as a problem, not as a risk, but as someone backed by clarity, structure, and consequence. And once that happens, people behave differently. They stop improvising. They stop assuming. They stop crossing lines they hoped no one would notice, because silence can be mistaken for weakness. But presence changes everything. And from that moment on, they knew one thing for sure: I wasn't alone anymore. When my mother realized the power had shifted, she tried to act like nothing had changed. But you can't erase a moment that exposes your true intentions. The room's atmosphere had already altered. The tone of conversations changed. The confidence she once carried like a shield was gone. She started being careful. She stopped making decisions without asking permission. She stopped talking over me. She stopped assuming she could control the narrative. Because now someone else had stepped into the game, and he wasn't playing for sympathy. He was playing for truth. That's the thing about power. When you lose it, you don't just become quieter, you become desperate. My mother's sudden politeness didn't feel like kindness. It felt like damage control. But it was too late, because I had already learned something crucial while I was recovering. I had learned that I was stronger than they thought. I had learned that my voice mattered. I had learned that even when you're weak, you can still observe, still understand, still prepare. And I had learned that there are people in your life who will protect you, even when you can't protect yourself. Once I had access to my baby again, the bond didn't just return, it grew stronger. holding my child for the first time after everything felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been stolen. The warmth, the weight, the small, innocent breath against my chest. It wasn't just a moment of relief. It was a moment of victory. Because in that moment, I knew my mother's rejection didn't define me. It didn't define my child. It only exposed who she really was. From that day forward, I changed the rules. I stopped allowing my family to treat me like I didn't matter. I stopped accepting control disguised as help. I stopped letting people speak for me. And I started taking my place as a mother, fully, confidently, and unapologetically. My mother never apologized. She never admitted what she did, but she didn't need to. The truth was already written in every quiet moment I had endured, in every hallway conversation, in every paper signed without my knowledge, in every second she chose her pride over my child. And when she realized that truth could no longer be hidden, she retreated, because the game had changed, and I was no longer the person she could control. I was the person she underestimated. The person who survived the accident, the person who watched in silence, the person who learned the rules, the person who came back stronger, the person who, in the end, took everything back. Not with revenge, with power, with truth, with love, because the most dangerous thing you can do to someone who tried to destroy you is rise above them and become unbreakable. If this story made you feel something, you're not alone. Hit like, subscribe, and comment, I believe you, because sometimes the only thing that heals is knowing someone understands.